Mateen is a U of T alumna. He studied civil engineering here. He completed his BASC and then an MEng. And he's previously worked in consulting and also at the Ministry of Transportation. He lives a car-free life in Toronto and gets around the city on a bicycle with his children year-round. Mateen, the floor is all yours.
Thank you so much, Mahia, and thank you for ITE University of Toronto chapter for having me for this seminar. As Mahia said, this presentation is about the City of Toronto's Vision Zero Road Safety Plan, and I just hope to give a quick overview to you all, and like Mahia said, talk about some of our projects and what we're doing, and hopefully you can have a greater appreciation for the efforts that the city is undertaking to eliminate road safety fatalities on the road network. To start, I just wanted to start with the land acknowledgement. So I will read this. While we meet today on a virtual platform, I would like to take a moment to acknowledge the importance of the lands which we each call home. We do this to reaffirm our commitment and responsibility in improving relationships between nations and to improving our own understanding of local Indigenous peoples and their cultures. We acknowledge that the land we live and work on is the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and it is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. We also acknowledge that Toronto is covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit. So quickly about me, as Mahia said, I am also a University of Toronto alumni. I remember myself attending seminars just like this. It seems like not that long ago, but looking at those dates, it was quite a while ago. And following my tenure at the University of Toronto, I did work at IBI Group as a transportation planner. I moved on to the MTO and worked at the Pan Am's Games branch, which was a very interesting project we developed and delivered. And I've been at the City of Toronto since 2018. So just quickly an overview of the City of Toronto. We don't need to go into this in very much detail, but just to help understand that the transportation network at the City of Toronto is very complex. We're talking about millions of people working here, millions of people going in and out every day, a large road network, lots of intersections, so lots of opportunities for there to be issues. So all this to say, like I said, safety is a complex issue. And this is just an overview of kind of the rate of fatalities. So you can see Toronto in the orange there. Relatively lower, especially when compared to the other North American jurisdictions, but still obviously room for improvement. All these other ones below demonstrate that it's very possible to reduce that further. And again, the goal should be, and is in our case, 0. This is just an overview of kind of the last 15 or so years of killed and serious injury collisions. Actually, sorry, these are just fatalities in the City of Toronto. So, I mean, we like to highlight the kind of 2011 to 2016 increase. And part of that, worrisome trend was the impetus for developing the Vision Zero Road Safety Plan, that along with kind of the changing mindset around road safety across the world, actually. So the road safety plan was actually initiated in 2016. And while, we do see a plateau after that and not maybe the reduction we may be hoping for, it's hard at this point to say whether we bucked, a trend or whether, there's a combination of different factors that resulted in kind of that plateauing. 2020, obviously, we all know is a very unique year everywhere in the world with the pandemic. So we tend not to look at that reduction as a sign of, our efforts, which is challenging because it's hard for us to track the progress that we've had in the road safety plan. But the reality is we know that 2020 is unique. 2021 is also going to be unique. We don't know, what the steady state new normal is going to look like, but it will be interesting to keep tracking this over time. And one thing I really want to highlight here that maybe is not evident when you just look at the overall numbers is actually how these numbers break down as far as what type of road users are, being involved in these fatalities. So you can see, maybe in 2005, you have maybe a 2/3 non-auto fatality rate. But as you can see, that automobile user mode kind of that number decreases over time as we know that cars are getting safer. However, unfortunately, that has not resulted in the decline in overall numbers, but we can actually see that the pedestrian and even motorcyclist fatalities have been going up. So obviously, there's a worrying trend about who is being involved in these kind of collisions. Quickly about the traditional way we used to look at road safety versus the moving towards a Vision Zero approach. So it's really about changing the mindset that, traffic fatalities are not inevitable. They're in fact preventable. And collisions are not due to non-compliant road users. We know that humans are going to make mistakes. Drivers may be put into situations where they can't, perform perfectly. So we need to make sure that the roads are designed and operated so that if those mistakes happen, they don't result in serious injury and fatality. And again, that comes down to moving away from looking at all collisions and trying to reduce them to actually just looking at the serious ones, the ones that result in personal injury and fatalities. And again, moving away from, it's the driver's responsibility or any road user's responsibility for their own safety, but it's a shared one between those who design, build, operate, and use the road network. And to also move away from being just reactive to historical collisions, but to be proactive and systematic at looking at how we can improve things across the jurisdiction. You may know that in many ways, it's kind of random when and where a collision happens. So it's about identifying where they could happen and ensuring that the design is conducive to avoiding and preventing those collisions. And ultimately, the Vision Zero Road Safety Plan, when it was developed, it was reliant on the 5 E's you may have heard. So engineering, as in design and construction, is, I would admit, the primary way we're currently doing it. But along with that comes education, messaging out to people about how to use the road network safety or messaging out any changes we make. Enforcement, obviously, particularly with any sort of speed limit changes or regulatory changes, we would rely on some enforcement there. Then engagement, getting feedback and evaluation, ultimately to make sure that what we're doing is most effective. And the City of Toronto Transportation Services can't deliver this on our own, so we obviously have lots of partners that are helping us to move this forward. And I just wanted to really, before I get into the meat of the work, I just wanted to touch a little bit on equity. It's a really interesting thing that at the city we're really trying to learn more about and be more conscious of. This is just a quick map. The areas that are highlighted in the light green there are the neighborhood improvement areas. So those are areas that have been identified by the city as areas where, there's been a historic, let's say, underfunding, or there's apartment neighborhoods that have additional needs. And then the little call-out bubbles are basically all the wards represented by the ones that have the most 311 calls. So you can see the most, requests that are coming in, the most questions. And we really want to try to, and the main thing here is to say that there's very little, if no overlap between those two. So we really want to make sure that we're not just responsive to, kind of the squeaky wheel thing where we're hearing a lot from people who are more engaged, whether politically or just municipally with their councillors, let's say, who have the ear of their councillors, who can get more done. We want to make sure that we're being a bit more systematic and making sure that we're covering everywhere. And to that, and I won't read these, but like the city in transportation services, we've developed an equity mission to make sure that we're being more conscious of that. And admittedly, I think I'll be the first to admit, and I think the entire organization would say that this is something we're still learning about. It's something that we know historically has not been part of our mandate, and we have not been thinking about this. But to really make sure that moving forward, our work has this lens on it to make sure that we're avoiding kind of those easy pitfalls we can fall into. And again, the idea is road safety for all, regardless of mode, socioeconomic status. So all of these protected grounds, really, we need to make sure that we're being conscious of that at all times. This is just a quick, interesting thing about how we use data to make decisions. So this first chart you can see it's from 2019, basically all collisions by mode, and this one is broken down into the different severity as well as, like I said, mode. So here you can see our driver collisions. We have nearly 2,000, so more than double the passenger and pedestrian collisions. So just looking at this on its own, you can say, oh, well, clearly we need to focus on driver safety because they're being involved in the most collisions. But then we actually break it down and we look at, actually, let's remove the minor collisions and actually see how it looks with the major and fatal. Then we see that shows that, you know what, maybe it's not that those driver collisions that are the main issues, but we actually need to look at those pedestrians because they far are overrepresented from the overall collisions. And similarly, you get that breakdown when you just look at the fatals. So this is really why when we developed our Vision Zero Road Safety Plan, the focus was on looking at strictly these killed and serious injury collisions for most of our planning, because those are the collisions we're trying to prevent, and they may not be represented by the overall collision kind of picture. Similarly, if we look at, you know, the population by age versus the percentage of injury collisions that they're involved in, we can actually see, you know, other than the young being underrepresented and kind of that late teen to 30 age being overrepresented, which kind of meets our expectations of those population groups. After that, it kind of follows the population curve in that they're represented just as much as they are represented as part of the population. However, then when we look at the fatalities, we see that actually the older adults are far overrepresented in that, and really indicating to us that there's something unique about that population. And in this case, it's most likely that their bodies physically can't withstand kind of the impacts that are related to those collisions, so they tend to succumb to their injuries much more frequently. So this tells us that there's something unique about this population that we should really look at them separately. And to that end, you know, when the road safety plan was developed, these emphasis areas were looked at again as unique populations that need a primary focus. So again, you would expect kind of the vulnerable road user class, like the pedestrians or cyclists, even motorcyclists, which don't have the kind of the protection of the vehicle around them as much. And then, like I said, older adult school children have those unique needs. Heavy trucks was actually one that was added later. There was a few high profile collisions involving construction. So that's something that the Transportation Services has been asked to look at separately. Again, I'm not going to go into this in detail, but this is just an example of the way that we're using data to identify hotspots. So these are, you know, for 5 years between 2014 and 2018, all the killed and injury collisions, whether they be mid-block collisions or intersection level collisions, and trying to help us, you know, whether these intersections require additional study to identify what is it that makes them a bit more susceptible to these kind of collisions, or you know, whether or not there's something in our toolkit that we can apply right away to help improve that safety. Again, this is a bit more of a reactive approach, but it's still very valid in that if we're seeing that trend, we want to make sure that we're addressing it. Similarly, if we look at this chart, so the bars basically show how much of the roadway is represented by each road class. So as you can see, obviously local roads or our minor roads or our residential roads make up the bulk of our road network. However, they're significantly underrepresented as shown by that orange line of the overall number of collisions. So we're actually seeing that arterials really, again, are overrepresented in our fatal collisions. And you can come to your own conclusions on why that is. And when we look at it more, obviously, you know, we have high speeds as a primary cause of that. And then we start to look at, you know, all of the pedestrian collisions. We can kind of identify problem areas of, you know, areas where we see that most of these collisions are happening. So for example, if we look at all the pedestrian collisions, we can see that, you know, about 40% of them are happening mid-block. If a pedestrian is trying to cross at an unsignalized location, maybe they're not able to judge the timing well, and there's an unfortunate collision there. And then surprisingly, you may think, is the next highest percentage is these left turns at intersections when the pedestrian does have the right of way. So obviously this shouldn't be happening, and the city has proactively been looking at ways that we can improve that. The mid-block one is a little more complicated in that it's representative of an issue, but it's harder to figure out what is going to help solve that issue. I'm not going to go into this one in detail, but I just wanted to show this as something that we undertook as, you know, let's look at the Scarborough district of the city. So one of the 4 that the city is broken down into, and see if there's anything unique about that district. So in the top left, you can see there that while the overall collision rate is the lowest in the city, the overall fatality rate is the highest. So again, this is just telling us there's something unique here. And as we try to break it down, we can see that again, there are some unique things about Scarborough that have resulted in this issue. So like on the next page, we can see that it has the longest length of high-speed arterials, which are speed limits of 60 or more. It has the longest walking distance between protected crossings, which, as you can imagine, then would potentially encourage pedestrians to cross mid-block because they want to avoid, taking a long, they would consider as a detour to go to a signalized crossing, even though it's safer. Really big overview of kind of some of the citywide safety programs. I'm going to go into some of these in detail, but I just wanted to present these as kind of like, this is what the city is doing, and it's quite a lot. And some of these we were doing before the road safety plan. We were always building signals because that's the way the traffic has always been managed, and it also has that safety benefit. But since then, we've also introduced tons of new programs. You may have seen these watch your speed signs. Those are new. School safety zones is something that's been of very visible and public interest. Automated speed enforcement, you may have seen, was introduced in the last few years, and somewhat divisive, but I mean, realistically, we haven't heard the complaints we were expecting, and we really think that's a strong tool that's going to help us going forward. So coming back to when I was talking about the overrepresented of the arterials, we know, I'm sure you've all seen things like this, or the next slide I'm going to show, but the faster you're driving, the harder it is to react to unexpected things. The faster the vehicle is moving, the less likely the pedestrian or it is to survive a collision. And that comes down to that bottom point there where arterial collisions. So to that end, part of the Vision Zero Road Safety Plan update actually was a speed management strategy. So really working on finding ways to lower speeds on the road. And this is something that's actually, having been around for a while, I know that 10 to 15 years ago, it may have been something that was relatively undesirable by the public, but especially by our politicians, that really felt like we need to make sure Toronto is moving at all times. We want to avoid congestion. We want to, avoid delays. But it's really been recognized that, the safety concerns around those speeds far outweigh the concerns with the congestion or delay. So again, we know that it just changing speed limits is not going to get the job done. So it's really a more of a holistic program that involves, particularly you would imagine road design improvements. Like that's something that we're dealing with over, 100 years of roads being designed primarily to move vehicles, to start thinking about let's slow them down and help to move people. Watch your speed signs, automated speed enforcement, just public engagement, just really trying to make sure we have that buy-in for what we're doing. So I'll go into some of these in more details. Yeah, for example, when the Vision Zero Road Safety Plan update was put forward, there was about 250 kilometers of speed limit reductions that went through. Again, without much resistance. The political will is behind this. And despite some frustrating emails we may get, someone says, "Why did you change the speed limit?" And admittedly, despite maybe some compliance issues, we got buy-in and we have done a large swath of speed limit reductions, and we are continuing to do that. And you may see in the future, we've started rolling out a 30-kilometer-an-hour speed limit reduction on all local roads. So again, this isn't going to be the ones just in the downtown. This is going to be all local roads across the city. We're going to roll out speed limit reductions to 30. We want to make it so that when somebody enters a residential neighborhood, the context tells them that this is a 30-kilometer-an-hour area. I don't want someone driving that fast in front of my house, so why would I do that in front of someone else's house? And this is something that we're doing based on a recent change to the Highway Traffic Act. We're changing the way that these are signed. So some other municipalities you may have seen have been using this method as well, where actually you just sign at the gateways, and when someone enters a neighborhood, they know that unless they see a different speed limit sign, the speed limit is 30. And we know it's going to be a bit of a learning curve. We're relying on the councillors to ease concerns with their constituents, But ultimately, when this is rolled out across the city, the intention is that this is the default. You know what it is, and you're responsible for maintaining that speed. And when I mentioned, better designing our roadways, there's many different ways where we need to think about that. Over design of the roadways is quite contrary to safety. It often allows people to drive faster. And what we're looking at here is kind of turning movements the right turning movements in this case, where we know that these movements are ones that can conflict with pedestrian movements at an intersection. If you're going right turning, you're crossing, both pedestrian crosswalks. So one or the other, it's going to be conflicting with the right of way of a pedestrian. And then the more you slow down a vehicle that's making that movement, the safer it is, the more chance they have to react. And even if there is a collision, it's much less severe. So it's really starting to think about right-sizing those turning movements, those curb radii, so that we can slow down those turning movements. And again, it's common sense that it works, but we've even done the effort to demonstrate that. So I don't know if you've seen something like this, but this is a near-miss analysis, which is based on algorithmic analysis of video data, which kind of flags any time a vehicle and a pedestrian get too close to each other, where you would call it a near miss. Like I said earlier, actual collisions, particularly serious ones, are relatively low frequency to the point where they're somewhat random where they occur. So if you have one at an intersection 1 year, you don't know if you're going to have one there next year. But these near misses we know are much more common, and they can be indicative of a concern. And in this case, this analysis was done, and you can see, an 80% reduction in near misses alone from that turning radii reduction, both reducing the crossing distance for those pedestrians as well as slowing down those vehicles that were turning. And it allows us to do stuff like this, where these are two one-way streets where there are no turning movements. So why not give that space back to the pedestrians? This is a downtown intersection. It gets really busy. I believe this is on the Bay Corridor, where we know that there's lots of movements around, particularly around the train schedule, for example, when people there's like those surges of pedestrians going to Union Station. So this both allows us to gain that space back for the pedestrians. And then we've actually come up with some interesting alternatives around concerns where there's heavy truck movement, and we know that we then have to over-design those curb radii to facilitate those movements. However, whether it be 95% of the other movements are, smaller passenger vehicles, they don't need that curb radii. So why are we designing for the worst case scenario? And in this case, we've actually recently developed guidelines for what we call truck aprons. So the intention is that the passenger vehicles will kind of take the long way around, but it allows for the heavy trucks to perform their movement with a wider turn so that they can mount that asphalt kind of curb. But when they're not there, it actually allows the pedestrians to use that space more safely. And you can imagine outside of intersections, it's been studied and it's been shown that the wider the lane is, the more comfortable the drivers are, the faster they drive. And as we demonstrated earlier, we know that's a cause for concern and results in more serious collisions. So that's also a part of the effort. Again, we are challenged in that road narrowing as a permanent measure is something that we don't do even during reconstruction. So it's something that has to wait for, we don't do it during resurfacing. It has to wait for reconstruction, which, based on the lifespan of our streets is relatively long in timeline. 35 years for an arterial, but double that potentially for a local road, which has low volumes. So the hope is that when we do them now, we do them right so that they last for their lifespan and they are more safely. Again, this is kind of an intersection level project that was completed. That intersection that you can see on the left, totally unnecessarily wide, leads to really long crossing distances. Allows vehicles turning left, turning right to pick up quite a lot of speed as they move. This is a relatively low volume area I would expect for pedestrians and vehicles. You can see there's a school on the left, so obviously, actually maybe not, maybe that's just the house. But regardless, It's relatively low volume, but you never know, right? Something can happen, and it's our responsibility that when we have this opportunity, let's look to improve the situation, narrow the lanes, and even then, you actually are able to gain more, whether it be public land, area for landscaping. I have some other examples. This one is one. If you've been able to get to the campus, you may be familiar, just a bit west of the campus, near College and Bathurst. Previously, there was, this right turn channel movement. Seems very over-designed for an intersection with relatively low volume. So you have, the left lane. It's actually a T intersection, so the left lane further from us is for left turning movements, and then the one closest is for right turning movements. So at the expense of vehicles not being delayed waiting for left turns to make their right turns, we've created these really wide, long crosswalks, and two of them where, again, that chance of conflict is there, versus what we've been able to do since then. We'll get rid of that channel, compress that down to just one outlet for that street. Left and right turns are happening at the same lane. And then we were able to gain some of that land back for some landscaping, sitting area. This is by a hospital. You can see that would not only benefit safety, but would also kind of benefit the public realm in the area. This is another similar one. You'll see a lot of these right turn channels, which have been designed, 50 years ago or so, allow a vehicle to make a right turn without stopping. In this case, you see just has a yield sign. Again, higher speed. So even though this is a signalized intersection, that right turn channel is an unsignalized crossing for the pedestrians. And again, based on their sight lines, they can't see around the corner. It leads to potential conflicts and collisions in that area. So when these do come up for reconstruction, it's a great opportunity to look at eliminating that, right sizing the intersection, again, gaining that public realm, and just making the overall intersection a bit off. And even when we do, let's just say that we know that other work is happening, and we know that in about 5 years, that work will be done. We can take advantage of, if we know we're going to be making improvements, we can get ahead of that and kind of implement those improvements at a temporary basis in the meantime. So we've been trying to really understand how to best use kind of paint and flexible bollards in order to narrow those lanes, right size those intersections before we get to the point where we're able to do the permanent fixes. So this is an example, again, a really wide intersection, over wide. Nobody needs all that space to make the appropriate turning movements. So we're able to use paint and bollards to kind of choke up that crosswalk. Technically, the crosswalk isn't narrower, but at least with those bollards, there's some sense of protection in that, you can see 60% of that crosswalk is now behind those bollards. Still requires a lot of attentiveness from the pedestrians to make sure that nobody is misusing the intersection. But again, we know that that's what we want the intersection to look like in the future. So we're able to proactively implement that quickly. Another one here on Bay Street. Again, a really wide crosswalk. You have that on-street parking there all day, so there's no need for that wide opening and that long crossing distance. So take that opportunity to narrow the mouth of the intersection, to more formalize that blocked lane anyway, and allow those pedestrians a bit more safety in reducing their exposure in that crosswalk. Some other interesting things we're doing, again, we've also formalized a design guideline for raised intersections. So we don't consider these speed humps or traffic calming because they're installed at stop controlled intersections, so the driver would be expected to stop. But the idea is, as they proceed through the intersection, there's a raised crosswalk. It's kind of like a speed hump. It both helps to raise the pedestrians a bit higher, particularly for young children who may be short. Vehicles are getting bigger and it's harder for drivers to see over their hoods. This raises them a little bit, makes them a bit more prominent, but also then causes the driver to have to proceed through the intersection a bit more slowly, because of that vertical change in elevation. Challenges with this are, there's lots of changes to drainage. You can't just kind of lay down a speed hump-ish crosswalk on top of this, so it does require a full redesign. So we're trying to roll these out whenever there's a reconstruction, but we hope to see these much more across the city. I mentioned before those mid-block crossings, we know that they're a concern. So we're really trying to be proactive and understand why that is. Most likely, this is an example in Scarborough, most likely when you have generators on both sides, and like I said, that long distance to the next protected crossing, it may result in pedestrians more willing to take the risk and cross mid-block. Again, stuff like looking at high-risk mid-block segments for potential, mid-block signals, whether they be pedestrian signals or formal intersection signals, may be a better way of allowing those pedestrians an opportunity to cross at a protected crossing. And I know we're working with TTC to look at, is there some TTC stops that are also resulting in this kind of behavior that we could potentially move to a protected crosswalk? And in some cases, if they're felt to be superfluous, the TTC may remove them altogether. Leading pedestrian intervals, sometimes we call them head starts, pedestrian head starts. It's something that I'm sure if you've been around the Toronto intersections in the last few years, you've seen more and more. We're really being proactive in rolling these out. We actually committed to doing them everywhere that's possible. So this basically allows the pedestrians about 5 seconds of walk time before the parallel vehicular movements are able to proceed, and with the intention of the pedestrians establishing themselves in the crosswalk before those opposing and potentially conflicting traffic movements begin. So yeah, it's really great. We're doing, now hundreds of these per year. Still a lot. There's over 2,000 intersections across the city, but we really feel like this is helping with particularly the left turning movements to increase safety there. It's been proven and demonstrated, and it's a relatively cost-efficient fix. It's really just signal timing changing. Most of our cabinets can already handle this, so it's just about going in there, changing the signal timing, and you're gaining that safety benefit. Truck safety, like I said, it's something that's been a bit more high profile based on some unfortunate incidents with construction vehicles. So this is something that we're a bit challenged in that there's only so much we can do as far as the road network goes. Again, we're trying with those curb radii reductions, but the city has kind of committed to at least improving safety in our own fleet. But ultimately, for the broader kind of vehicle safety, it does require a bit more federal intervention as far as having stricter safety standards for those vehicles. So again, we're hoping that does continue to improve, but the city is doing what we can to help that. And again, we know these challenges. On a highway, it's one thing where the relatively straight movements, but the complexity of operating a vehicle this big in a busy city obviously can lead to its own issues. Again, all of these shaded areas are the blind spots of the truck. So when you have lots of cyclists going around these trucks, you can imagine the areas of concern. Flex posts we're hoping to do a bit more of. We've demonstrated they're relatively effective on a narrower roadway, where it kind of, again, that physical, I don't want to call it a barrier, but it's at least a reminder to slow down. It on these narrow local roads where they're relatively wide. This helps to create like a little chokehold maybe that would slow down a vehicle that's passing by. We want to install them around schools particularly, but also looking at them as in the broader traffic calming toolkit. Left turn calming, we recently started a pilot of this. Essentially, it's a hardened curb at the center line that causes left turning vehicles to both change their angle of approach, which helps with sightline issues for those pedestrians. They're not obscured potentially by the frame of the car, as well as it slows them down because of that wider turning radius. So this is something that we've installed some pilot locations. We're doing some video analysis on them, and we believe that they will be effective. They've been effective at other jurisdictions that have done this, so we would hope to be able to roll these out, particularly at some of the wider intersections where the vehicle is able to really pick up a lot of speed as they make that left turn, just because of the number of lanes that they're traversing. Enforcement is something that we know based on some internal documents that the police have shared, has been something that the police have not kind of been focusing on, as far as speed particularly, and some dangerous driving practices they haven't really been enforcing as much as we want. So we're really trying to push for more of that. Again, we know that there are challenges and issues with enforcement, with manned enforcement. You know, we really need to think about who is being enforced, where and when that enforcement is happening, and whether or not we're applying that equity lens when that enforcement is happening. So this is something we're learning more about. We have engaged in some partnerships with the police to make sure that they're being a bit more proactive, but we do think that that's definitely a key tool in road safety, particularly if we're doing speed limits. It really helps if those reductions are enforced by actual active enforcement. And again, automated speed enforcement is something that the city has been doing in the last 1 or 2 years, and that's something that we hope will expand in the future. You may have seen this, a highway safety manual was developed about 10 years ago, but we really looked at this as a way of confirming some of the approaches we're doing, especially if they're relatively untested in the city. The Crash Modification Factor Clearinghouse has lots of high quality studies in there that have shown how some of these safety countermeasures have been effective in other jurisdictions. So using that, we can see, you know, some of these measures that we've been doing have demonstrated benefits, safety benefits that's been demonstrated in other jurisdictions, and there's no reason why we would expect that that would be different here. So I would encourage, if you're not familiar, if you're interested in road safety, to learn a little bit more about the Highway Safety Manual. It's a really great resource. And then again, we talked about education and engagement. These are just some campaigns that we've been running. We try to do quite a few every year, try to keep people engaged in thinking about road safety. You know, as we said earlier, we're all partners in this, and ultimately the users do share a lot of responsibility in the way that the road network is used, and how safety should be on the forefront. So we try to remind them through education like this. And I would encourage you, if you haven't, to take a look at some of the things on the city's website. In the last few years, we've developed this dashboard as well as this map, where we've kind of trying to celebrate what we're doing and to highlight that to people, that, you know, the city is putting a lot of effort in improving road safety. And here's how. So a lot of countermeasures are listed there. It even has actually the full data set of the collisions as well. So if you're interested in what's happening in an area as far as safety measures, as well as comparing that to the historic collisions, you can definitely use that tool. I think that's my last slide. So I really want to thank you all for having me. It's been a pleasure to present this to you, and I hope it was useful and productive. And I believe I am on to answer some questions, so I'm more than happy to do that.